Welcome to In the Shadows, where I'm your host, Jack. Tonight, we're diving into scary stories to fall asleep to. This is a black screen video with no ads, just the sound of rain and the eerie calm of horror. As you relax and listen, let the rain wash over you. Comment below where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always fascinated and grateful to know. Don't forget to like and subscribe, since there will be no breaks in the show tonight. Settle in and let the darkness take over. I've got to start by saying that Emily and I never thought we'd have kids. We had tried for years, and after the last doctor's visit, we'd pretty much come to terms with it. You know how it is, you try to make the best of things. We told ourselves we'd travel more, maybe adopt a dog or something. But deep down, I think we were both heartbroken. Then, out of nowhere, it happened. Emily missed her period, took a test, and boom, 2 pink lines. I couldn't believe it at first. Part of me thought the test was faulty, or she was just late. But nope. 3 tests later, all of them positive, and we're sitting in the doctor's office getting the confirmation. "Congratulations, you're pregnant," the doctor said with this big smile, like he'd just delivered a miracle himself. Emily burst into tears, and I was just sitting there, stunned. It's weird, I didn't know how to feel, you know? Years of wanting it, and when it finally happened, I was completely caught off guard. But Emily, she was over the moon. Everything seemed great for a while. We were setting up the nursery, talking baby names, the whole shebang. And then things started getting strange. It was around week 10 when Emily changed. Not just a little mood swing or two. This was something else entirely. She started talking in her sleep, and not just mumbling like normal people do. I mean, full-on conversations, but in a language I didn't recognize. It sounded harsh, like guttural. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and see her standing by the window, just staring out into the rain. When I'd ask her what she was doing, she'd just say, "The baby wanted to look outside." At first, I thought she was just being quirky. Pregnant women get weird cravings, do weird stuff, right? But it got worse. There was this one night I'll never forget. I woke up because I heard her whispering again, only this time it wasn't in her sleep. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, cradling her stomach and speaking to it like she was having a conversation. I couldn't hear all of it, but what I did hear made my skin crawl. She said, "I know what you want. I'll make sure he does it." I sat up, not even sure what to say. "Emily, who are you talking to?" She turned to me, eyes dark, almost like she didn't recognize me for a second, and just said, "The baby, he's telling me things." I laughed it off because what else could I do? But in the back of my mind, I knew something was wrong. The next day, she acted like nothing happened. Back to baby talk and nursery colors. But it kept sticking with me, that look in her eyes when she talked about the baby. Like she knew something I didn't. Fast forward a few weeks, and she started getting these strange ideas in her head. We were having dinner one night, the rain tapping against the window, and out of nowhere she says, "We need to keep the house dark. The baby doesn't like the light." I kind of laughed, thinking she was joking, but she wasn't. She got angry, like really angry. She knocked her plate off the table, food went everywhere, and she just stormed off. I followed her upstairs, asking what the hell was going on, and she started scratching at her arms, digging her nails in deep, muttering, "He told me to do it. The baby told me to." I froze. What do you even say to that? I convinced her to see the doctor the next day. I didn't tell him about the weird stuff, just that she was acting different, really stressed. He said it was normal, hormones, changes in the body, yada yada. But something about it didn't sit right with me. Things escalated that night. It was late, pouring rain outside again, and I woke up to the sound of the bathroom faucet running. I rolled over and realized Emily wasn't in bed. I got up, walked into the hallway, and saw her standing in the middle of the living room, completely still. The only light was the flicker from the street lamp outside, and she was just staring. Her arms were scratched up again, and when I asked her what she was doing, she whispered, "He doesn't want you here." I had no idea who she meant, but I knew this wasn't just some pregnancy phase. Something had changed inside her, and it was getting worse. It wasn't just her anymore. It felt like the house had changed too. After that night, things went downhill fast. I mean, Emily wasn't just acting strange anymore, she was completely different. I tried talking to her, asking what was going on, but she'd brush it off or just flat out ignore me. She was distant, like she was in her own world, always muttering under her breath or staring out the windows whenever it rained, which, by the way, seemed to be happening a lot more lately. The storms would roll in, and it was like she came alive, almost as if she was waiting for them. I remember one night, I came home from work and the whole house was dark. I thought maybe the power had gone out, but then I saw the candlelight flickering from the living room. When I walked in, there was Emily, sitting cross-legged in the middle of the floor, surrounded by candles. Her eyes were closed, hands resting on her belly, and she was whispering again. That same weird language. I didn't even bother trying to understand it anymore. It wasn't meant for me. I asked her what she was doing, and she just looked up at me, smiled. This creepy, hollow smile, and said, "He likes the dark. He's stronger when it rains." I didn't know what to say. What do you say to that? So I just nodded, backed out of the room, and left her to it. Part of me wanted to call someone, anyone, to get her help, but another part of me, I don't know. I think I was scared of what they'd find, or worse, what they wouldn't. It wasn't just her talking to the baby anymore either. Things around the house were getting weird, like stuff would move on its own. I know how that sounds, but I swear, I'd leave a room and come back, and things would be in different places. Pictures turned upside down, chairs pulled away from the table, doors left open. At first, I thought Emily was doing it. Then one night, I realized it wasn't her at all. I was sitting in the kitchen, going through some old paperwork, when I heard this faint whispering from upstairs. I wasn't surprised at this point. Emily had been doing it so much I'd gotten used to it. But this time, the whispering wasn't coming from the bedroom, it was coming from the nursery. The problem was, Emily was asleep in bed. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, just listening, and I could hear it. Soft, like it was coming from inside the walls, a low, raspy voice whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't Emily's voice. I went up, as quietly as I could, and opened the nursery door. The rain was hitting the window hard, and the room was dark except for this faint glow from the streetlight outside. And there, in the middle of the room, was the baby's crib. Empty, of course. But the whispering didn't stop. In fact, it got louder. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow on the wall. You know, the kind you'd expect with the streetlight shining in. But this shadow, it wasn't right. It didn't match anything in the room. It was moving, kind of pulsing, like it was breathing. I blinked, thinking maybe I was just seeing things, but it stayed there, stretching across the wall like it was alive. And then it whispered again. This time, clear as day. Help me grow. I backed out of the room so fast I nearly tripped. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and ran back downstairs. I sat on the couch, staring at the ceiling, trying to wrap my head around what just happened. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear that whisper, see that shadow. It was like the house itself had changed, like something had crept in when I wasn't looking. And Emily, God, Emily, she was changing too. A couple days later, I tried to talk to her about it. I told her about the whispering, about the shadow. You know what she said? She laughed. Actually laughed and said, "He's just getting stronger. It's normal. You'll see." She looked at me like I was the one losing my mind. That's when I started digging into the house's history. I figured maybe there was something here before, some bad history. I wasn't wrong. Turns out, the land our house was built on wasn't just any old plot. It had been owned by a man named Henry Thatcher. He was some kind of occultist back in the 1800s. There were rumors that he'd been trying to summon a demon. Yeah, you heard me right. A demon by using his pregnant wife. The baby never survived, and Thatcher disappeared not long after. Some said he killed himself, others said the demon took him. I don't know what to believe, but after reading that, everything started to make a sick kind of sense. The more I read, the more I realized we were sitting on the same land where this guy had done his rituals. Emily wasn't just losing it, Something was happening to her, to the baby, and whatever it was connected to this place. But what really set me over the edge was when I got a call from this old woman. She said her name was Martha Thatcher, last descendant of Henry. She told me the ritual never ended. The demon was waiting for centuries for the right moment, the right child. And now it had found one. I hung up the phone, but her words stuck with me. That night, as the rain pounded against the house again, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and I heard it. That same whisper from the nursery. But this time, it was calling my name. After that phone call with Martha Thatcher, I felt like I was losing it. It's one thing to think something's off with your wife during pregnancy. It's a whole different thing when you've got some old woman telling you that a demon's after your kid. But no matter how crazy it sounded, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. Something was happening in that house, and it had its claws deep in Emily. I was trapped in this nightmare, and the worst part was that I had no idea how to wake up from it. Emily's behavior got even more bizarre. I'd catch her talking to the baby like she was getting instructions, but it wasn't just normal baby talk. She'd say things like, "Don't worry, I'll make sure he does what you want." Or, "It's almost time. He's almost ready." She wouldn't even look at me half the time, just whispering to her belly like the baby was running the show. I tried to leave one night. I packed a bag, thinking maybe if I got out of the house for a few days, I could clear my head, figure out what to do next. I told Emily I was going to my brother's for the weekend, just to get some space. She didn't even blink. She looked up at me from the kitchen table, smiled that hollow smile of hers, and said, "You're not going anywhere. The baby won't let you." That's when I noticed the knife in her hand. She was cutting up vegetables, but the way she was gripping that knife, it didn't feel right, like she wasn't just chopping carrots anymore. I dropped my bag right there, hands up like I was trying to calm her down. Okay, I'm staying," I said, backing away. "We'll figure this out together." She just nodded, went back to cutting, and that was the end of it. But I knew I was stuck. Whatever had a hold of her wasn't letting me leave. That night, I couldn't sleep. The rain was coming down hard again, and every time I closed my eyes, I swore I heard something. A voice, low and raspy, like it was right next to me, whispering from the dark corners of the room. I kept my eyes shut tight, hoping it would go away, but the voice just got louder. "He's almost here," it said. "You'll do what we need." I shot up in bed, looked over at Emily, and saw her staring at me with those dark, empty eyes. "It's time, Michael," she said. "We need you." I didn't know what she meant, but I was done asking questions. I got up, ready to head downstairs, maybe get some water, anything to break the tension. But before I could move, she grabbed my arm. Hard. I mean, harder than she ever could have before. "He's almost here," she repeated, her voice low, like she wasn't even talking to me anymore. "You have to be ready." I pried her hand off me and left the room, trying to shake off the feeling that I was in way over my head. I went downstairs, stood by the window, and just watched the rain. That's when I saw it. There, right at the edge of our yard, by the old oak tree, was a figure. I could barely make it out in the rain, but it was standing perfectly still, like it was watching the house. Watching me. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but it didn't move. I turned away for a second, trying to catch my breath, but when I looked back, it was gone. The next day, I went online, trying to find anything I could about these rituals, demons, possession, anything that might explain what was happening to Emily. That's when I came across this paranormal investigator, Ray, who specialized in stuff like this. I shot him an email, not expecting much, but he replied almost immediately. Said he could come by the house the next day, see what we were dealing with. When Ray showed up, it was raining again, of course. The guy looked like he'd seen some stuff. Gray hoodie, old beat-up cap, and a face that said he didn't scare easy. He walked through the house, asked me some questions about Emily's behavior, the strange occurrences, the history of the house. I told him about the shadows, the whispers, the phone call from Martha Thatcher. He didn't flinch once. When I told him about the figure in the yard, he just nodded like it was all part of the job. Ray said something that stuck with me. "These things feed off weakness. They push you to do what they want, and the more you resist, the harder they push. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "It's not about the baby, it's about you." That night, after Ray left, I was sitting in the living room, the sound of rain drumming against the windows, when Emily came downstairs. She was wearing this long white nightgown, soaked from head to toe. I jumped up, asking where the hell she'd been, but she didn't answer. She just walked over to me, put her hand on my chest, and whispered, "It's time. We need you to help him come through." I backed away, but she kept coming closer, eyes wide, that same hollow smile plastered across her face. "He's coming, Michael. You're gonna help him be born." And then, before I could even react, she took my hand and pressed it against her stomach. That's when I felt it. Something moving. But it wasn't just the baby kicking. It was like there was something else in there. Something bigger. Something alive. And it wanted out. I stumbled back, my mind racing, trying to process what was happening. "Emily, we need help," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This isn't right. We need to stop whatever this is." She just laughed. A deep, echoing laugh that didn't sound like her at all. "You can't stop it," she said. "It's too late. He's already here." I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The rain fell harder, the wind howled outside, and all I could do was sit there, watching the shadows twist and move in the corners of the room. The baby was coming, and it wasn't alone. I barely made it through the next day. I felt like I was living in some kind of waking nightmare, and every second that passed, I knew we were getting closer to whatever this thing was trying to do. Emily had stopped speaking to me like she used to. Now, everything she said felt rehearsed, like she was repeating lines someone else was feeding her. And the baby, man, I don't know how to describe it, but it was like I could feel it watching me, even when I wasn't looking at Emily's belly. Ray came back that evening, and by the time he got there, the rain was coming down in sheets again. It felt like it hadn't stopped in weeks. He brought this weird old book with him, said it had rituals in it that could stop what was happening. A reverse summoning, he called it. Whatever that meant, I didn't care. At this point, I was desperate for anything that might work. We sat at the kitchen table, going over what we needed to do. Ray explained that we had to do this ritual at the exact moment the baby was ready to be born. Said the timing was everything. If we missed it, the demon would fully cross over. It wasn't just about Emily or the baby anymore. It was about keeping something much darker from stepping into our world. Emily wasn't happy about any of it. When I told her we were going to stop this, that we were going to help her and the baby, she just stared at me with this cold look in her eyes. "You can't stop him," she said, almost like she was disappointed in me. "He needs you, Michael. You have to help him." That's when Ray pulled me aside and laid it all out. "Look, man, I've seen this before," he said, his voice low, like he didn't want Emily to hear. "She's not just under the influence. She's possessed, but not by the demon itself. No, it's using the baby as a conduit. If we can stop the birth, we stop the demon from crossing over." That hit me hard. How do you tell someone their wife and unborn child are being used as puppets for something straight out of hell? But what choice did I have? The plan was simple, at least on paper. We'd wait until Emily went into labor, then perform the ritual to banish the demon before it could fully manifest. Ray said it was risky, that things could go south real quick if we didn't get it right. But honestly, what was I supposed to do? Just sit back and let this thing take over my life? That night, I sat by the window, watching the rain pour down. Emily was upstairs resting, or at least, that's what I told myself. The house felt heavier, like something was pressing down on us, watching every move we made. Ray had set up candles around the living room, muttering something about protection and warding off dark forces. It all sounded like some bad horror movie, but after everything I'd seen, I wasn't about to argue. Around midnight, Emily screamed. I shot up from the couch and ran upstairs, Ray right behind me. When I opened the bedroom door, I saw her standing in the middle of the room, clutching her stomach, eyes wide with this twisted grin on her face. "He's coming," she said, her voice almost gleeful. "You have to help him, Michael. It's time." I looked at Ray, and he nodded. This was it. The moment we'd been dreading. Emily doubled over, clutching her belly, her breathing shallow and ragged. I ran over to her, tried to comfort her, but the second I touched her, she grabbed my wrist with an iron grip. "You have to let him through," she whispered, her face inches from mine. "You know you want to. You've always wanted this." Ray lit the candles and started chanting something in that old language. The same language I'd heard Emily whispering in her sleep. The air in the room grew thick, like the walls were closing in, and I could feel something dark pushing against us, trying to break through. Emily's body jerked, and she let out this horrible sound, like she was caught between laughing and screaming. Her eyes rolled back, and for a second I thought she was going to collapse, but she didn't. She stood up straight, her hands resting on her stomach, and smiled. Not at me, not at Ray, but at the space in front of her, like she was looking at someone or something we couldn't see. I grabbed her shoulders, shaking her, trying to snap her out of it, but she just kept smiling. "He's here," she whispered. "He's finally here." Ray shouted something in that strange language, and the candles flared up, their flames dancing wildly in the air. Emily's body stiffened, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. She wasn't in control anymore. Whatever was inside her was fighting back. I held her tight, watching as Ray continued the ritual, his voice growing louder with each word. The room seemed to darken around us, the air humming with energy, and then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The candles went out, the room went still, and Emily collapsed into my arms. For a moment, I thought it was over. I thought we'd won. But then, she opened her eyes. They weren't her eyes anymore. She looked up at me, and in a voice that wasn't hers, she said, "You're too late. He's here." The baby wasn't coming anymore. The baby was already here, and whatever it was using Emily's body to finish the job. When Emily looked up at me with those cold, dead eyes, I knew we were screwed. Everything Ray had said, everything I'd tried to believe, it didn't matter anymore. The baby wasn't the baby. It never was. It was just a gateway for something much worse, and now it was here, right in front of me, wearing Emily's body like a mask. Ray stood frozen in the corner, staring at her like he didn't know what to do. All his rituals, his spells, none of it had worked. The demon had beaten us. I held Emily, or at least what was left of her, in my arms, and I felt completely helpless. She smiled up at me, but there was no warmth behind it, just emptiness. "He's here now, Michael," she said, her voice low and calm, like we were having a normal conversation. "And you're going to help him grow." I let go of her and backed away, stumbling against the wall. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm not helping anything. This stops now." Emily, or the thing inside her, just laughed, this horrible echoing sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "You've been helping all along," she said, standing up slowly, her movements unnatural, jerky, like she wasn't used to controlling her own body. "From the moment you found out I was pregnant, you've been feeding him, giving him everything he needs, your fear, your doubt, your weakness. It's all made him stronger." I looked over at Ray, hoping for some kind of plan, but he just shook his head, completely at a loss. He muttered something under his breath, but I could tell he had nothing left. We were out of options. Emily walked over to me, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "You don't have to fight it anymore," she whispered, her voice soft, almost comforting. "You can let go now. Just accept it. He'll make everything right." I backed away, shaking my head. No, this isn't happening. I'm not doing this." But deep down, I knew she was right. I'd already been playing into the demon's hands for months. Every step I took, every decision I made, it had all been leading to this moment. Ray finally stepped forward, his voice shaking as he spoke. "We can still stop this," he said, his eyes locked on Emily. "We just need to finish the ritual. There's still time." Emily turned to him, her smile widening. "You really don't get it, do you?" she said, her voice dripping with malice. "There is no stopping it. He's here, and now you're just in the way." Before I could react, Emily lunged at Ray, moving faster than I'd ever seen her move. She grabbed him by the throat, slamming him against the wall with a strength that wasn't human. Ray gasped for air, his hands clawing at hers, but she didn't let go. She squeezed tighter, her eyes locked on his. and for a brief moment I saw something pass between them. Like she was draining the life out of him, pulling something from him that I couldn't see. I shouted her name, but she didn't stop. Ray's face turned red, then blue, his body twitching as he struggled to break free. But it was no use. With one final gasp, his body went limp, and Emily let him drop to the floor like he was nothing. I stood there frozen, staring at Ray's lifeless body. He was gone. Just like that. Emily turned to me, her eyes dark and cold. "Now, it's your turn," she said, stepping closer, her hand still resting on her stomach. "He needs you, Michael. You're the final piece." I couldn't move, couldn't think. I just stood there, watching her approach, knowing that whatever happened next, I wasn't going to make it out of this. And then something inside me snapped. Maybe it was desperation, maybe it was pure instinct, but I ran. I bolted for the front door, my feet slipping on the wet floor from the rain that had blown in earlier. I could hear Emily behind me, her footsteps slow and deliberate, like she knew there was no point in rushing. She didn't need to chase me. She knew I couldn't escape. I made it outside, into the pouring rain, the wind whipping against my face. I didn't know where I was going. Hell, I didn't even know why I was running. But I kept going, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I could outrun whatever was coming for me. But I didn't get far. Just as I reached the edge of the yard, something pulled me back. Not physically, but it was like an invisible hand reached out and grabbed me, yanking me to a stop. I turned around, and there she was, standing in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the flickering light inside the house. "You can't run from this, Michael," she called out, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "You were never meant to." I don't know why, but I started walking back toward her. It was like something inside me had given up, like I was being pulled back into the house, back into whatever nightmare waited for me inside. When I reached the door, Emily stepped aside, letting me pass. "Good," she whispered, her hand resting on my shoulder as I walked by. "It's time." I didn't fight it. I couldn't. I just followed her, step by step, back into the living room, where Ray's body still lay crumpled on the floor. The candles had burned out, and the room was bathed in this eerie, dim glow from the storm outside. Emily walked over to me, took my hand, and placed it on her stomach. "He's ready now," she said, her voice soft, almost loving. "And you're going to help him." I closed my eyes, feeling the life growing inside her. But it wasn't a baby, it was something else, something dark, something that had been waiting for centuries, and I was its final piece. I don't know how long I stood there, my hand on her stomach, listening to her whisper those words over and over again. But eventually, I felt it. The life inside her shifted, moving beneath my hand, like it was reaching out to me, claiming me. And in that moment, I realized that I wasn't fighting for Emily anymore. I was fighting for myself. I pulled away, stumbling back, my head spinning, my whole body feeling like it was being torn apart from the inside. "No," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I'm not doing this." Emily smiled, her eyes glowing in the dim light. "You don't have a choice, Michael," she said, stepping closer. "You never did." I don't remember what happened next. All I know is that when I woke up, I was alone. Emily was gone. The house was empty, and the rain was still falling. Look, I never thought I'd be the kind of guy who'd fall back on prayer. I mean, growing up, I was dragged to church every Sunday, but it didn't stick with me as an adult. I wasn't anti it or anything, just, I don't know, it felt like something you do when you're out of options, you know? And man, did I run out of options. Fast. It was one of those nights, raining hard, everything dark and quiet, except for the sound of water hitting the windows. I just had the worst week of my life. My wife Sarah wasn't speaking to me. Work was a joke. I was drowning in bills. I remember sitting on the couch staring at the TV, but not really watching it. That's when it hit me. Maybe I needed something outside myself to fix this mess. So I did it. I prayed. Yeah, judge me if you want, but I didn't have much else going for me. I asked for help with the usual stuff, money, peace, Sarah not hating my guts anymore. Real original, right? I wasn't even sure what I was doing. It felt awkward, like talking to a wall. But hey, I figured it couldn't hurt, right? The next morning, I got up like usual, rain still drizzling, but something felt different. You ever have one of those days where, out of nowhere, things just seem to go your way? I got to work, and my boss calls me into his office. I was already bracing myself for bad news, because that's how things had been going, but instead, he gave me a promotion. Out of nowhere. I'm talking a big one too. More money, fewer headaches, the works. I couldn't believe it. Part of me thought, wow, maybe that prayer thing works after all. But there was this tiny, nagging feeling, like maybe it was too good to be true. I brushed it off though. Who was I to question a good thing, right? That night, as the rain started picking up again, I told Sarah about the promotion, and she actually smiled. The first real smile I'd seen from her in weeks. For a second, I thought things were finally turning around. So I prayed again, this time thanking, whoever was listening, and I asked for more, for things to keep getting better. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not usually the kind of guy to push his luck, but when you've been in the gutter as long as I had, a little bit of good luck feels like the world's biggest blessing. But that's the thing with blessings. Sometimes they're not what they seem. By the end of that week, things were looking up, at least on the surface. My bills were manageable thanks to the raise. Sarah and I weren't fighting as much. Hell, I even got my car fixed without spending a fortune. It was like everything I touched turned to gold. But, and here's the weird part, people around me started acting different. Not everyone, just a few. My boss, for one, he'd given me the promotion, right? But now he wouldn't look me in the eye. It was like he'd done me a favor and then immediately regretted it. At first, I thought maybe I'd done something wrong, but nah, it was something else. Sarah, too. She was nicer, sure, but in this strange, distant way. Like she wasn't fully there. It's hard to explain, but it's like she was going through the motions. It should have made me happy, right? But instead, it felt like there was this invisible wall between us. It didn't make sense. I remember one evening, rain coming down hard again, the house quiet, except for that steady rhythm against the windows. I sat there in the living room, feeling a chill, but I told myself it was just the weather. That's when I started thinking, maybe, just maybe, those prayers weren't exactly being answered by who I thought they were. So, the rain kept falling, and life kept getting weirder. The thing is, when everything seems to be going your way, you don't ask too many questions at first. I mean, why would you? But when stuff that should make you happy starts feeling off, you can't help but wonder what's really going on. I'd been praying every night, like clockwork. It was almost automatic. I'd sit there, listen to the rain tapping against the window, and throw out another prayer. Sometimes for work, sometimes for Sarah, sometimes just for peace of mind. And every time, things would get better, or at least seem better. But then Sarah, she changed. Not in some dramatic way, but little by little, it was like she wasn't her anymore. She wasn't angry with me like before, but her smiles, they didn't feel real. We'd have a conversation and she'd respond, but it was like her words were hollow, like there was no real emotion behind them. I remember thinking, while I prayed for her to forgive me, maybe this is just how it works. But deep down, I knew something was off. One night, it was pouring outside. One of those nights where it feels like the rain is never going to stop. We were sitting at the dinner table, eating in silence, and I was watching her. She was there, but it was like she wasn't there, you know? I tried asking her about her day, but her answers were short, almost mechanical. No spark, no life. I wanted to ask if she was okay, but something inside me said not to. So I just kept quiet. Work wasn't much better. That promotion should have been the highlight of my year, but instead, it became a curse. My boss, the guy who'd given it to me, was avoiding me like the plague. At first, I thought it was just him being stressed, but it was more than that. The whole office seemed tense, like people were walking on eggshells around me. No one said anything outright, but I could tell something was wrong. One morning, I came in, and the whole vibe was just weird. A few of my coworkers had left early the day before, and no one was saying why. The office felt quieter than usual, like something bad had happened, but nobody wanted to talk about it. I overheard someone whispering that one of the guys in our department had quit, just up and left without saying a word. No goodbye, nothing. It wasn't long before more stuff started happening. I'd prayed for money, and next thing I knew, my debt was disappearing. Some legal loophole, they said. Yeah, it was a relief, but the way it happened so fast, it didn't sit right with me. Then my neighbor, the one who always gave me trouble, suddenly he packed up and moved out. No explanation. I didn't even get to say goodbye, not that I wanted to. But it felt like everything I'd been praying for was being delivered in these strange, unsettling ways. And then the real kicker. One night, I was sitting in bed, late, the rain going strong outside. I was half awake, trying to drift off. That's when I heard it. A voice. No joke, a low, calm voice, like someone was standing right next to the bed, whispering in my ear. It said, "I've heard your prayers. You'll get what you want. Just keep asking." I shot up, looked around, but no one was there. Sarah was fast asleep next to me, dead to the world. I tried telling myself it was a dream, or maybe I'd imagined it, but I knew I didn't. That voice was real as the rain pounding against the window. And that's when it hit me. Maybe these prayers weren't being answered the way I thought. Maybe something else was listening, something that wasn't giving me blessings, but something darker, twisted. That night, I didn't pray. I couldn't bring myself to do it. But a part of me knew. It was too late to stop. I didn't stop praying for long, though. I wish I could say I had the strength to just quit, but when life keeps throwing problems at you, it's hard not to fall back on something that seems to work. Even if, deep down, you know something's off. It's like driving a car that's making a weird noise. You tell yourself it's nothing, that it'll get you where you need to go. Until it doesn't. After that night with the voice, things started getting worse in ways I couldn't ignore. Sarah, she wasn't just distant anymore. She started acting strange, like she'd sit in front of the TV for hours without moving. I'd come home, and she'd be in the same spot as when I left, eyes glued to the screen but not really watching anything. It was like she was lost in some kind of trance. I tried snapping her out of it a few times, but she'd just give me this blank look and mumble something I couldn't make sense of. I thought maybe she was depressed. Maybe everything that had happened between us had messed with her head more than I realized. But it wasn't just that. She started doing things that made no sense. One night, I woke up and found her standing in the hallway, staring at the front door. When I asked her what she was doing, she just said, "I'm waiting for it to come." When I asked her what it was, she didn't answer. She just went back to bed like nothing happened. It was freaky, but I tried to brush it off. Tried telling myself it was stress, or maybe she was just sleepwalking. But every time I thought about it, that voice from the other night would echo in my head. Just keep asking. And here's the thing, I did keep asking. I couldn't stop. Work was falling apart too. People were quitting left and right. My boss? Yeah, he died. Car accident. They said it was a freak thing, but part of me wondered. I prayed for my job to get easier, didn't I? And now it was. No more boss, no more competition, just me running the show. And let me tell you, that wasn't the kind of blessing I'd been hoping for. Then there was Sarah. I didn't know what to do. I prayed for her to get better, to be herself again, but nothing changed. If anything, she got worse. One night, I found her sitting on the bed, staring out the window at the rain, her lips moving but no sound coming out. It looked like she was praying, but not to the God I thought I'd been praying to. Her eyes had this glazed over look, like she was somewhere far away. I tried shaking her out of it, but she just smiled at me. This empty, cold smile that didn't belong on her face. I could feel it then, the cold creeping in, like there was something else in the room with us, watching, waiting. It wasn't long after that when I started noticing things around the house, weird things. Like the crucifix on the wall above our bed, it had started to rust, like the metal itself was decaying. The wooden frame, that too. It was almost rotting. And the strange part was, the rest of the house was fine, just that one spot, right above where I prayed every night. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong, really wrong. One evening, when Sarah had finally gone to bed early, I sat down in the living room, listening to the rain hammering against the windows. That's when I decided to stop. No more prayers, no more asking for help. I wasn't sure what I was dealing with, but I knew it wasn't good. And that's when I heard it again, that voice. Only this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was louder, clearer, almost amused. "You'll get what you want, David. Just one more prayer. That's all it takes. I didn't pray that night or the next, but everything kept spiraling. The town started feeling off, too. People were on edge, accidents were happening more often. It was like the world around me was decaying in ways I couldn't explain. Like something dark was spreading, and it all started from me. I knew then that this wasn't a coincidence. Whatever I'd been praying to, it wasn't God. And now, it was coming for me. By the time I realized how deep in I was, it was too late to undo any of it. I kept thinking, maybe if I just stopped earlier. Maybe if I hadn't prayed that first time. But you know how it is. Once you start something, it's hard to quit when things seem to be getting better, even if they're not really better at all. Sarah got worse. She wasn't talking much anymore, barely even moving, to be honest. She'd sit in the same spot for hours, staring at nothing, like she was waiting for something. And then, one night, she just collapsed. I found her lying in the hallway, her body completely still, her eyes open but unseeing. It was like she'd just shut down. I rushed her to the hospital, rain pouring down the whole drive, making everything look blurry and unreal. The doctors didn't know what was wrong. They said it was like she was in a coma, but they couldn't explain why. There was nothing physically wrong with her. It was like her mind just disconnected. They kept her in a bed, hooked up to machines, but they weren't giving me any answers. I tried praying for her that night, but as soon as I closed my eyes, I felt this deep, crawling sense of dread. That voice was there again, right in the back of my head. Just one more, David. You'll have everything you want. I couldn't do it. I couldn't bring myself to ask for anything. That's when I knew I needed help. Not from prayer, but from someone who knew what the hell was going on. There was this old priest in town, Father Markson. He'd been around forever, kind of a staple at the local church. I wasn't a regular, but everyone knew him. If anyone had answers, it was him. So, one rainy evening, I drove over to the church. It was nearly dark, and the place was empty. The rain tapped against the stained glass windows as I stepped inside, a constant, steady reminder that things were far from normal. I found Father Markson in the back, lighting candles by the altar. He looked up when I walked in, like he already knew why I was there. "I need to talk to you," I said, not really sure how to explain everything without sounding crazy. But he didn't seem surprised. He just nodded, like he'd heard this story before. He sat me down, and I started talking. Told him about the prayers, about Sarah, about the promotion, the weird accidents, all of it. I kept expecting him to interrupt, to tell me I was overreacting or that it was all in my head, but he didn't. He just listened, his face getting more serious with every word I said. When I finally stopped, he sat back in his chair, thinking for a minute. Then he told me something that made my stomach drop. There are things, dark things, that listen when you pray out of desperation, he said, his voice calm but heavy. Not all prayers reach the ears of God, David. Sometimes, when your heart is filled with fear and anger, something else answers. He told me about an old legend, one I'd never heard before. A demon that feeds on desperate prayers, twisting them, making them come true, but at a price. It doesn't come all at once. It starts small, little favors here and there. But with each answered prayer, you're giving it more control. You're opening the door wider and wider until it's too late to close it. You've been praying to the wrong thing, Father Markson said, his eyes locking onto mine. And it's not going to stop until it takes everything from you. I felt sick, like the whole world had shifted under me. Everything that had happened, everything I thought was some kind of blessing, had been twisted by this thing. And now it was coming for me, for Sarah, for everything I loved. "What do I do?" I asked him, my voice barely steady. Father Markson shook his head, looking almost sad. "It's not easy to break a bond like this. It feeds on your desires, on your fear. The only way to stop it is to stop asking, stop praying to it. But the more you resist, the harder it'll fight to pull you back in." That night, I drove home. The rain still falling hard, my mind racing. I had to figure out a way to stop this thing, but I didn't know how. All I knew was that every prayer I'd sent up had brought this demon closer to me, closer to Sarah, closer to taking everything. I knew I couldn't pray again, but the demon wasn't going to make that easy. I barely slept that night. The rain kept pounding against the windows, and every time I closed my eyes, I heard that voice. "Just one more, David." One more prayer, and it'll all be over. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was louder, like it was right there, sitting beside me, waiting for me to give in. I knew I was running out of time. Sarah wasn't getting any better. She was still in that hospital bed, her body motionless, her eyes empty. The doctors didn't know what to do, but I did. I knew this was my fault. This thing, this demon, had gotten to her because of me, because of every desperate prayer I'd made. I kept thinking about what Father Markson had said. Stop asking. Easier said than done. Every part of me wanted to pray for her, to pray for this nightmare to end. But I knew what that would mean. The next few days were a blur. I avoided the church, avoided anything that reminded me of prayer. But the more I stayed away, the more things fell apart. Work was a disaster. People were quitting left and right. There were rumors of violence, accidents, and strange things happening in town. And Sarah, well, she wasn't getting better. If anything, she was slipping further away. And the voice, it never stopped. Every night, when the rain would start up again, that voice would be there, whispering in the dark. You know what you need to do. One more prayer, and it'll all be over. I tried ignoring it. I really did. But one night, as the rain poured down harder than ever, I broke. I sat in the living room, staring out the window at the sheets of water falling from the sky, and I whispered the words I swore I wouldn't say. I prayed for Sarah to come back. I prayed for everything to go back to the way it was. I just wanted my life back. I wanted her back. And then, just like that, the voice responded. I knew you'd come around, it said, with a kind of sick satisfaction in its tone. For a second, everything went quiet. The rain, the wind, all of it, like the world had just stopped. Then, I heard a knock at the door. I froze. I wasn't expecting anyone, and it was the middle of the night, in the middle of a storm. But the knock came again, louder this time. I walked to the door, every step feeling heavier than the last. I don't know what I was expecting, but when I opened it, there was nothing there. Just rain, and a figure standing in the distance, barely visible through the downpour. It was Sarah. She was standing in the middle of the yard, in her hospital gown, looking like she hadn't been gone for weeks. For a second, I was flooded with relief. I thought maybe my prayer had worked, that she was back. But as she walked closer, I realized something was wrong. Her eyes, they weren't Sarah's eyes. They were cold, empty, and they didn't blink. She smiled at me, but it wasn't her smile. It was something else, something cruel. David, she said, her voice soft but hollow. I'm back, just like you wanted. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was stand there as she stepped inside, the rain dripping off her pale skin. Why don't you pray for something else? She asked, her voice sweet but mocking. Pray for everything you've ever wanted. It's so easy, David. Just one more prayer. That's when I knew this wasn't Sarah. This was the demon, the thing I'd been praying to all along. It had her now, and it was using her to get to me. I backed away, shaking my head. No, no more. I muttered, barely able to get the words out. I'm done. The thing that looked like Sarah just smiled wider, stepping closer. Oh, but you're not. You've already made your choice. You prayed, and now I'm here. In that moment, I realized there was only one way to stop it. Only one thing I could do to break the cycle. I had to make a final prayer, but not for myself, not for Sarah. I had to sacrifice everything to stop it from taking more. So I did the only thing I could think of. I closed my eyes, and I prayed for the demon to take me instead. Take me, but leave Sarah alone. Leave everything else alone. The room went silent again. I opened my eyes, and the figure that was pretending to be Sarah was gone. The rain had stopped. Everything was still. For a brief moment, I thought maybe I'd won. Maybe it was over. But when I looked in the mirror, I realized the truth. I was still there, physically. But it wasn't me anymore. The demon had taken my body, my life. I could see through my eyes, but I wasn't in control. I was trapped, watching as it went about my life, twisting everything into something dark and horrible. And that's where I am now, stuck, a prisoner in my own skin. The rain started again, and I know it's still out there, waiting for someone else to start praying. It all started on a night like any other. It was raining, the kind of rain that makes you want to curl up in bed and just scroll mindlessly through your phone. Which, let's be honest, is exactly what I was doing. It had been a rough few months for me, trying to make it as an influencer. You know how it is, constant posting, trying to get the lighting just right, hashtagging like it's a full-time job, but still getting no traction. I was just another face in the endless stream of social media wannabes. I'd posted a video earlier that day. Nothing special, just me doing some dumb challenge I saw trending. It barely got a dozen likes, and part of me was already debating whether to delete it or let it die quietly. I was lying there, phone in hand, rain tapping against the window, when a message popped up from an account I didn't recognize. The username was something weird, like @followerfiend or some other nonsense, but I was bored enough to click. The message was short. Want to go viral? Accept the help you've always needed. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds like one of those spam messages, right? I thought the same thing at first, but something about it was different, like the words were jumping off the screen at me. I sat there for a minute, thinking it was probably some scam, but then, I don't know, something inside me wanted to reply. Part of me figured, what's the harm? I wasn't exactly lighting up the internet on my own, so I replied, just a simple, what kind of help? And then the weirdest thing happened. My phone started buzzing, not like a normal buzz, but like it had its own heartbeat or something. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe the rain playing tricks on me. But that message? It didn't go away. In fact, more of them started coming in, almost instantly. You'll see. Post again. At this point, I was hooked. I should have put the phone down, I know, but instead, I went back to my feed and posted something random. A quick video of the rain, captioned with something cheesy like rainy night vibes. I didn't expect much, but within minutes the likes started pouring in. I mean, seriously pouring in. At first I figured it was a fluke, maybe the algorithm was being kind for once. But then the comments started, and they were all from accounts I'd never seen before, like they were just popping out of nowhere. Things like more, or you're next. I didn't even know what that meant. Next for what? But there was this rush, like the kind of thrill you get when you suddenly realize people are actually watching you. For the first time in months, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I was finally breaking through. It was around midnight when I got another message from @followerfiend. Keep going, there's so much more for you. That's when I knew this wasn't just some random spam bot. Something about the way those words looked on the screen felt off. But I wasn't about to question it. I was going viral, after all. So, the next day rolls around, and I'm still riding that high from the night before. It's funny, you know, how quickly that need for more creeps in. It wasn't just about posting anymore. It was about the numbers, the likes, the comments, watching that little notification counter go up. I hadn't felt that kind of rush in a long time. I woke up to hundreds of new followers, and my post from the night before had exploded. The rain video, of all things, had gone viral. I didn't get it, but I wasn't about to question it. I figured I had to ride this wave as long as it lasted. So I posted again. Something dumb. Me making coffee in my kitchen, talking about how I'm one of those people who can't function without caffeine. It didn't take long for the likes to start pouring in. And just like before, the comments were flooding my notifications. But this time, they were weirder. People, well, accounts kept saying things like, "What's next?" and "Do it for us." I shrugged it off at first. Probably just trolls trying to mess with me, but that rush, that feeling of being seen, of being wanted, I wasn't gonna let that go, so I posted more. This time, a prank video where I snuck up on my roommate Dan and scared the crap out of him. It was a cheap shot, but people ate it up, or at least those strange accounts did. The thing is, when you start chasing likes, it's never enough. That high, it fades fast, and you find yourself looking for the next thing, something bigger, something better. I was scrolling through the comments on that prank video when I got another message from followerfiend. More excitement. They're waiting. I laughed a little at first because seriously, who talks like that? But as soon as I read it, I knew what I had to do. I started thinking about what kind of content I could make that would keep the attention going. That's when it hit me. People love seeing someone get in trouble. So, I did something I'd never done before. I filmed myself sneaking into a local store and spray painting a wall in the alley. Yeah, I know, not exactly my proudest moment, but it worked. The second I posted it, the numbers shot up even higher. But here's the thing. As soon as I hit post, my phone buzzed again, just like before. This time, the message said, "Now they see you. Keep going." I didn't even know what that meant. See me? Who's they? But I didn't have time to think about it because the comments started getting darker. People were telling me to take it further, to show them more, and not in a fun, playful way. More like they wanted me to do something dangerous. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I put my phone down and tried to shake off the weird feeling creeping in. But part of me, I was already thinking about what I'd do next. The idea that this was all building up to something bigger. It was pulling me in. By the time the sun went down that evening, I was sitting there staring at my phone, waiting for the next message. And sure enough, just as the rain started again outside, it came. "You're not done yet." By the time I got that next message, I was in too deep to back out. It sounds stupid now, but at the time I figured, what's the worst that could happen? I mean, it's just social media, right? But that night, something felt different. There was this weird charge in the air, like the rain outside wasn't just your average drizzle. It was heavier, and it didn't stop, like it was waiting for something. I knew I should have quit then, but when that notification popped up, my hand moved before I even thought about it. I clicked. The message was short. "Do something dangerous. They'll love it." I sat there, staring at the screen, wondering who the hell they were. My mind started racing with ideas, and none of them were good. But the likes, man, the comments, they were still coming in from that last video, and the high, it was addictive. I wanted more. No, I needed more. I thought about the local train tracks that ran just outside of town. Late at night, the freight trains would come through, and no one would be around to see them. A perfect spot for something risky. So I grabbed my jacket and headed out. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time I got to the tracks, but everything was soaked. The whole area looked abandoned, like I was the only person left in the world. I set up my phone to film, feeling ridiculous, but also kind of excited. I posted a quick teaser. "Big stunt coming, stay tuned." And almost immediately, the comments started. "Do it. Can't wait. Show us something real." It was like they were all waiting for me to screw up. But that's the thing, part of me wanted to give them exactly what they were asking for. So I waited for the train. When I finally heard it coming, I moved closer to the tracks, just close enough to make it look dangerous. But something weird happened. As the train got closer, my phone started buzzing again, harder than ever before. This time, it felt like it was burning in my pocket. I pulled it out, and there it was. Another message from @followerfiend. Closer. I didn't want to do it. I knew this was crossing a line, but before I could stop myself, I was stepping closer to the tracks, phone in hand, filming the whole thing. I could hear the trains whistle, louder now, and part of me thought maybe I'd gone too far. Just then, the message popped up again. Now. That's when things went south. I felt this weird pull, like something was dragging me toward the tracks. My legs moved on their own. It wasn't like I was walking. I was being pulled. The train was just feet away when I snapped out of it. I jumped back, just in time, the roar of the train deafening as it flew past. My heart wasn't pounding, no adrenaline rush like you'd expect. Just this overwhelming realization that something was really, really wrong. I looked down at my phone, still filming. The comments were pouring in, hundreds of them. But instead of excitement, they were filled with these creepy, almost celebratory messages. "We saw you. You're almost there. More. Show us more." I shut off the camera and bolted back to my car. The rain started pouring again, harder than before, as if the whole world was trying to wash away whatever I'd just done. But when I got home and tried to delete the video, my phone wouldn't let me. It was like the app had a mind of its own. The video was live, and people were watching. That's when the message popped up again. "Don't stop now. They're watching." I got home that night, soaked through, my head spinning from what had just happened. The rain hadn't let up, and it felt like the world outside was closing in. I kept telling myself it was just in my head, that this was all some weird coincidence. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Really wrong. I tossed my phone on the counter and tried to walk away from it, tried to focus on something else. But the buzzing started again, over and over. That constant vibration, like the thing was alive and calling out to me. I didn't want to look, but of course I did. More messages. But this time, they weren't just from @followerfiend. They were from a bunch of random accounts, all saying the same thing. More, show us more. It was like they knew what I was doing. Like they could see me through the screen. And the worst part? The video from the train tracks? It had gone viral. I was getting thousands of views, comments, shares, and it didn't feel good anymore. It felt like I was losing control. I tried to shut it down, delete the app, turn off my phone, but nothing worked. Every time I pressed delete, it was back on my screen, like it wasn't going anywhere. And then, without even thinking, I was filming again. This time, it wasn't something I planned, I just did it. I grabbed my phone, hit record, and started walking. In the rain, of course, because why not, right? It felt like the rain had become part of everything. It followed me wherever I went, almost like it was watching too. I filmed myself walking down the street, passing the dark houses, the empty stores. No one was out. No one ever seemed to be out when this stuff happened. Just me and my phone. And that's when it happened. The blackout. 1 minute I'm walking. The next, I'm standing outside the old factory on the edge of town. Phone still recording. No idea how I got there. The place had been shut down for years, but for some reason, I was standing at the gate, staring at the crumbling walls and busted windows like I belonged there. I looked down at my phone. It was buzzing again, but this time the message wasn't from @followerfiend. It was from me, or at least my account. It said, "Let them in." I don't even know what that meant, but something inside me felt like I had no choice. Like I wasn't even in control anymore. My legs moved on their own, pushing me toward the factory entrance. The place was trashed, graffiti everywhere, broken glass crunching under my shoes as I walked inside. I had no idea why I was there, but my phone kept buzzing, guiding me deeper into the building. And the comments, man, the comments were still coming in, like people were watching this live. Keep going, show us, we're waiting. By the time I reached the center of the factory, I realized I wasn't alone. There were other people there, people I recognized. Other local influencers, the ones who'd blown up around the same time I did. They were all standing there, phones in hand, just staring, like they were waiting for something. I tried to back out, to leave, but it was like my body wasn't my own anymore. I was stuck, trapped in some kind of twisted performance for an audience I couldn't see. And that's when I realized we weren't posting for followers. We were posting for them, whoever or whatever they were. They were watching us, feeding off every post, every like, every comment. And we were their puppets, dancing for their entertainment. I looked down at my phone one last time, and there it was. The message from @followerfiend. You're almost there, just one more step. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that screen. But when I finally looked up, the other influencers were gone. And I was standing there, alone in the rain, holding my phone like it was the only thing keeping me alive. The video was still live. The viewers were still watching. And I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to stop. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The rain kept pounding against the window, like it was reminding me of what was coming. It didn't stop, and neither did the messages. Every time I looked at my phone, there was another notification, another comment demanding more. Show us. Finish it. The words felt less like suggestions and more like commands at this point. I tried to ignore them, to act like everything was normal, but we both know that wasn't happening. Not anymore. I was trapped, and the worst part was that I had no idea how deep in I really was. The next morning, if you can even call it morning, was just more of the same. My phone wouldn't stop. The same buzzing, the same damn messages, and every time I thought I'd reached my breaking point, something pulled me back in. I couldn't get away from it. That's when I decided to live stream. Yeah, I know, sounds stupid, right? But I thought maybe, just maybe, if I told everyone what was really going on, if I exposed whatever the hell this was, I could stop it. I mean, it made sense in my head. If people saw what was happening, they'd understand. Maybe they'd even help me. So I set it up. Rain still coming down, evening settling in. It seemed fitting, honestly. I was going to go live, tell my story, warn people about the demon, or whatever it was, lurking behind the screen. I hit record, looked into the camera, and started talking. At first, it was just me rambling, about how this all started, how I thought it was just some random boost in my social media presence, how it felt like the algorithm had finally smiled on me, only to turn into something darker, more twisted. I was mid-sentence when it happened. My reflection on the screen, it changed. I wasn't looking at myself anymore. I mean, it was still me, but not me. My face was distorted, like something else had taken over. And the comments, they were going wild. Yes, finally, keep going. I tried to stop the stream, tried to shut it all down, but my hands wouldn't move the way I wanted them to. It wasn't me in control anymore. The phone felt like it had fused to my skin, like I was no longer the one posting, it was posting through me. I watched in horror as my reflection in the camera grinned. But I wasn't smiling. That thing, whatever it was, had taken over. It was using my body, my voice to entertain them. And the viewers? They loved it. The final message from Follower Fiend popped up on the screen, clear as day. You are one of us now. Time to welcome the others. That's when I realized there was no escape. My account, my presence online, it wasn't mine anymore. The demon had taken over, using my face, my voice to spread its influence, to pull others in. The stream kept going, even as I tried to shut it down. My reflection, that twisted version of me, spoke directly to the camera. Like and share if you want more. And the likes, they poured in. The comments flooded. I was trapped, watching myself from the inside, powerless as the demon used my account to reach out to more people. More victims. And that's how it ends. I'm still here, still posting. The rain hasn't stopped. And every time I look at my phone, the views climb higher. They're watching, they're always watching, and I can't stop them. I guess the whole thing started when I drove into Clearwater late one evening. It had been raining the entire way, and not the kind of light drizzle that makes everything look romantic either. We're talking that heavy, relentless rain that makes you think the sky's going to fall any second. By the time I arrived, the streets were empty, and the streetlights flickered like they were barely clinging to life. I pulled up outside the motel, and honestly, I didn't expect much. It was one of those places with a neon sign that probably hadn't worked right in years, and the front office smelled like damp carpet. The guy behind the counter didn't catch his name, barely looked up from his magazine when I asked for a room. He slid me the key without a word, and part of me thought, great, this is how every bad horror movie starts. Still, I was exhausted, and all I wanted was to get inside and dry off. My room was down the hall, and as I walked, the old floor creaked under the thin carpet. It wasn't comforting, but I figured it beat sleeping in the car. Now, here's where things got weird fast. After I threw my bag on the bed, I figured I'd go grab something to eat, maybe hit the local diner. But as I stepped outside, I noticed something about the rain. It had this smell to it, like metal or rust. You ever walk past an old junkyard and catch that whiff of decaying iron? It was like that, but stronger. I shrugged it off at first because let's be real, I've stayed in worse places than Clearwater, and weird smells come with the territory. The diner wasn't far, just a couple of blocks, and the streets still looked dead. Not a single person outside, which I chalked up to the weather. Inside, though, it was a different story. The place was packed with locals. Everyone seemed to know each other, which made sense for a small town, but there was this vibe, They were all drinking water, glasses of it on every table, and they weren't eating much, just sipping and watching me like I was the main attraction. I slid into a booth by the window, the rain still pounding against the glass, and a waitress, Clara, came over. She was polite enough, but something was off about her too. Maybe it was the way she stared a little too long, or the way she kept glancing back at the other tables like she was checking for permission. I asked for a coffee, but she just shook her head. "No coffee this late," she said. "Water's fresh, though, from the lake. Best in the county." I didn't want to be rude, so I took the glass she set down. The water had that same metallic smell, but I figured maybe it was just the pipes. I mean, small towns don't always have the best water systems, right? But the second I took a sip, I swear something shifted in me. Not in an obvious way, but like a small piece of my brain just blinked out for a second. I couldn't tell if it was the long drive or the rain or what, but I felt strange. Just for a moment. Then it passed and I brushed it off. Clara came back asking if I wanted anything else, but honestly, I wasn't hungry anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. As I paid and stood up, I noticed all the locals watching me again. Not in a hostile way, but in that quiet, eerie way that makes your skin crawl. I pushed open the door and the rain hit me like a wall. It was even heavier now, and for a second, I thought I saw someone standing in the downpour across the street, just watching. No umbrella, no jacket, just standing there. But when I blinked, they were gone. I made it back to the motel, soaked to the bone, and dropped into bed without even bothering to change. I was too tired to care about the weirdness of the day, and I figured I'd make more sense of it in the morning. But that night, I had this strange dream. I was standing by the lake, the same lake Clara had mentioned, and the water was so still it looked like glass. But something was moving beneath the surface. I couldn't see it clearly, just shadows swirling below, like the whole lake was alive. Then the rain started, and the lake turned black, swallowing everything. I woke up drenched in sweat, which didn't make sense because the room was freezing. I don't remember falling asleep with the window open, but sure enough, it was cracked just enough for the cold, wet air to seep in. The rain hadn't stopped. I didn't realize it at the time, but that dream was the first sign, the first clue that something was very wrong with this town. And that water? Yeah, that was just the beginning. The next day, the rain hadn't let up. It was still coming down in thick sheets, turning the streets into shallow rivers. I wasn't planning on sticking around Clearwater long, just enough to get the story on these strange accidents and head back to the city. But something about that dream kept gnawing at me. I couldn't shake it. And the weird thing was, I didn't feel like myself. It's hard to explain, but there was this hazy fog in my head, like my thoughts weren't quite lining up the way they should. I tried to write it off as lack of sleep, but deep down, I knew something was off. I decided to poke around a bit more, starting with the local water treatment plant. You'd think something like that would be hard to get into, but in a town like this, everything seemed pretty laid back. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time I pulled up, and a guy in a stained yellow raincoat was sitting by the gate. Didn't ask for my name, didn't even look up as I walked past him toward the building. Inside, the place smelled damp, like wet concrete and mildew. It wasn't a big operation, just a few rooms with old machinery that hummed a little too loud for comfort. The main guy running the place, Earl, was sitting at a desk, going through papers that looked ancient. Earl had that grizzled small-town vibe, complete with a 5-day beard and a blank gray hoodie that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. He didn't seem too happy to see me. "What are you doing here?" he grunted, barely looking up. I told him I was a journalist, just passing through, interested in how the town got its water. Earl gave me a long, hard look, then shrugged like he couldn't care less. "It's the lake," he said, scratching his beard. "Been getting our water from there since before I was born. Damn pure, too. People swear by it." I asked if there had been any changes recently. New pipes, filtration, anything like that. Earl grunted again, flipping through his papers like I wasn't even there. "New system went in about 6 months ago," he said finally. "Not that it's any of your business, but the town council decided to upgrade. Ain't nothing wrong with the old system if you ask me." That got me thinking. 6 months ago was when the reports of strange accidents started. Coincidence? Maybe. But I wasn't one to believe in coincidences. I tried asking him more, but Earl wasn't giving me anything. Just grunts and vague answers, so I thanked him and left, feeling like I'd hit a wall. As I walked out, I noticed a section of the plant that was roped off. No signs, no explanation, just a locked door with a heavy chain around it. I thought about asking, but Earl didn't seem like the kind of guy who'd give me a straight answer, so I let it go for now. That evening, I headed back to the diner. The rain had started picking up again, and I figured I'd try to catch Clara. She seemed like the only person who wasn't completely under this town's spell. When I walked in, the place was packed again. Same people as before, same eerie vibe. Everyone's still sipping on their damn water. I slid into the same booth, and sure enough, Clara came over. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, setting down the water before I could even ask. I didn't touch it. Instead, I asked her straight up, "What's the deal with the water?" She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder at the other tables like she was checking to make sure no one was listening. Then she leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "People here, they've changed," she said, her eyes darting around the room. It started when they installed the new water system. At first, it was small things, people getting forgetful, zoning out. Then it got worse. The accidents, the outbursts. It's like they're not themselves anymore. I asked her if she drank the water, and she shook her head. "No way. I stick to bottled. Something's wrong with it, but no one's talking. It's like they don't even realize it's happening." She was clearly shaken, and part of me wondered why she was still here. But before I could ask, she stood up, her eyes wide. "You need to leave," she whispered. "They're watching you." I turned to see what she was talking about, and sure enough, every single person in the diner was staring at me. Not in a curious way either. More like they were waiting for something. Something bad. I didn't stick around to find out what. I grabbed my coat and walked out into the rain, feeling like I'd just dodged a bullet. The streets were empty again, and the rain was coming down in sheets, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I could hear footsteps behind me, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. When I finally got back to the motel, I sat on the bed, staring at the glass of water Clara had left on the table. I didn't drink it, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. What was in that water? And why was no one doing anything about it? That night, the dream came back. Only this time, the shadows in the lake weren't just moving beneath the surface. They were rising. The rain didn't let up the next morning. I mean, it was like the entire town was sitting under a waterfall. Even with my car's wipers going full speed, it barely made a difference. I decided to drive around a bit, see if there were any other leads I could follow. But honestly, the more time I spent here, the more I started feeling, I don't know, fuzzy, like I was walking through a fog and couldn't quite wake up. It was weird. I found myself heading back toward the lake. That was where everything seemed to point. Clara's warnings, Earl's grunts, even my dreams. And in a town like Clearwater, everything led back to the water. The lake was the town's pride and joy, supposedly the cleanest, freshest source of water in the whole county. Except, now that I knew better, I couldn't stop thinking about what was lurking beneath the surface. I parked near the shore and stood there for a while, just staring at it. The rain was still coming down in sheets, bouncing off the water like 1,000 tiny needles. But there was something else. A ripple. Just one. It moved across the surface in a way that didn't make sense with the rain. Almost like something was swimming under there. I didn't stick around to find out what. Instead, I headed back toward the water treatment plant. I had to get a look behind that locked door. Earl wasn't in the front office this time, so I slipped inside. The hum of the machines was louder than I remembered, like they were working overtime to keep something hidden. The door to the locked section was still chained, but the padlock was old and rusted. A couple of tugs, and it snapped right off. I pushed open the door, half expecting alarms to go off, but the only sound was the low rumble of machinery. The room beyond was dark, lit only by a single flickering light. And there, in the center, was a massive tank filled with black water. I'm talking pitch black, like someone had poured ink into it. The surface rippled slightly, just like the lake. I took a step closer, my shoes squelching against the wet floor. And that's when I saw it. Small symbols etched into the side of the tank. Old symbols. The kind you see in books about ancient rituals. Suddenly, Earl's voice rang out from behind me. "You shouldn't be in here." he said, and when I turned, he was standing in the doorway, eyes darker than I remembered. His face was pale, his body stiff, like he was struggling to stand upright. You don't understand what you're messing with. It's too late. It's in the water. It's in us. I didn't know what to say. I mean, part of me thought he was messing with me, trying to scare me off. But then he stepped forward, and I saw something move behind his eyes. Like his pupils were swimming in that same blackness from the tank. I backed up, but Earl kept coming. We tried to stop it, he muttered, more to himself than to me. But it's too strong. It needs more of us. I wasn't sticking around to find out what more meant. I bolted out of the plant and into the rain, Earl's voice echoing in my head. It's too late. It's in us. I could still hear it as I reached my car and tore out of there, water spraying up from the tires. By the time I made it back to the motel, my head was pounding. It felt like someone had shoved cotton into my brain, blocking out my thoughts. I sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at the rain through the window, trying to make sense of everything. The water, the town, the strange symbols. It was all connected. But how? That night, the dream came back. Only this time, it wasn't just the lake. I was standing in the middle of Clearwater, and the rain was pouring down. But the people weren't normal. Their eyes were black, like they'd been filled with the same oily liquid from the lake. They weren't speaking, just staring at me, mouths slightly open, like they were waiting for something. Then, one by one, they turned and started walking toward the lake. I tried to move, to follow them, but my legs wouldn't work. I was stuck there, watching as they all disappeared into the water, their bodies swallowed up by the darkness. I woke up, drenched in sweat. Or maybe it was rain, because once again, the window was open, and the air was cold and wet. I hadn't opened it. But at that point, I didn't care. I needed to get out of there. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door, but something stopped me. A glass of water was sitting on the nightstand. I hadn't touched it, hadn't even thought about it since I got back. But now, for some reason, I was drawn to it. It was like my mind was split in two. One part of me knew I shouldn't, but the other part was curious. I reached out, my hand shaking slightly, and lifted the glass. The water was clear, no sign of the blackness I'd seen in the plant. But as I brought it closer to my mouth, I caught that metallic smell again. Rust, decay, and something else, something older. Before I could stop myself, I took a sip, and everything went black. When I came to, it was night again. The rain was still falling, but it sounded distant, like I was hearing it from miles away. I was lying on the motel bed, fully dressed, and my head felt wrong. There was this heaviness to it, like someone had stuffed it full of cotton, and I couldn't shake it. I sat up slowly, trying to remember what had happened. The water, I'd taken a sip, and then nothing. Just blackness. I looked around the room, half expecting Earl to be standing in the corner with that dead look in his eyes. But I was alone. My bag was still on the floor, untouched, and the glass of water was sitting there on the nightstand, as if daring me to take another sip. But I wasn't stupid. Whatever was in that water, I didn't want any more of it. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door, ready to get the hell out of Clearwater. But when I stepped outside, the streets were empty. Not just in that small town, everyone's asleep kind of way. I mean completely empty. No cars, no people, no noise except for the rain bouncing off the pavement. It was like the whole town had disappeared. I stood there for a minute, just trying to figure out what I was seeing, or what I wasn't seeing. Then I noticed it. In the distance, near the edge of town, there was this soft glow, like candlelight. And I realized something. The town wasn't empty. They were all there. At the lake. I don't know why, but I started walking toward it. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something else. I don't know. But my legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the water. The closer I got, the louder the rain seemed to get, pounding against the ground like a warning. By the time I reached the lake, I could see them. All the people from the diner, the motel, even Clara. They were standing at the edge of the water, staring into it. Their eyes were wide, and their hands were raised like they were praying to something. But it wasn't a prayer. It was something else. Something dark. I stood behind them, watching. None of them noticed me, or if they did, they didn't care. They were too focused on the lake. The water was completely still, except for that same ripple I'd seen before, moving across the surface like something was swimming just beneath it. Then, without warning, Clara stepped forward. I tried to call out, but my voice felt stuck, like something was holding it back. She walked straight into the lake, the water rising up to her ankles, then her knees, then her waist, and still, she kept going. The others followed, one by one, walking into the water like they were being pulled by some invisible force. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn around and get the hell out of there, but I couldn't move. It was like my feet were glued to the ground, and all I could do was watch as the entire town waded into the lake, disappearing beneath the surface. For a moment, everything was still. Just the sound of the rain and the ripples on the water. Then, out of the blackness, I saw it. Something moved beneath the surface, rising up slowly. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even human. It was massive, like a shadow made of oil and smoke with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel its presence. It was old. Older than the town, older than anything I'd ever seen. And it was angry. Suddenly, the water exploded, and the thing, whatever it was, started pulling the townspeople under. They didn't scream. They didn't even struggle. They just went under, one by one, vanishing into the dark water like they'd never existed. And then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. The water went still again, the rain tapping softly against the surface. The glow from the candles was gone, and I was alone. I stood there for a long time, staring at the lake, waiting for something to happen. Waiting for the thing to come for me. But it didn't. That's when I realized I wasn't like them. I hadn't been fully taken yet. I turned and ran, my legs finally working again, and I didn't stop until I reached the motel. I grabbed my car keys, threw my bag in the back seat, and sped out of Clearwater like the devil himself was chasing me. The rain kept coming down, harder and harder, blurring the road ahead. But I didn't care. I had to get out. It wasn't until I was miles outside of town, the rain finally letting up, that I realized something. I was thirsty, and the only water I had was from Clearwater. I gripped the steering wheel, staring at the bottle of water sitting in the passenger seat. It was from Clearwater, no doubt about it. I must have grabbed it earlier without thinking. My mouth felt like sandpaper, and part of me, the sane part, knew not to touch it. But there was this other part, this little voice in the back of my mind, whispering, "Just one sip? You're thirsty. What's the harm in one sip?" I shook my head and kept driving. The rain was still coming down, but it wasn't as bad as before. The farther I got from Clearwater, the lighter the rain seemed to get, like the storm was staying behind. But that heaviness in my head, that fog, it hadn't lifted. If anything, it was getting worse. I tried to focus on the road, but the events of the night kept playing over and over in my head. The lake, the townspeople disappearing into the water without a fight, that thing rising up from the darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I'd seen wasn't finished with me yet. I reached for the bottle of water without even thinking. My fingers curled around it, and I felt that same metallic chill I'd noticed before. The cap twisted off with a soft hiss, like it was releasing something more than just air. I brought it to my lips, the thirst so strong it was almost unbearable. And then I stopped. I don't know how, but I stopped. I slammed on the brakes, pulling the car over to the side of the road, and threw the bottle out the window. It bounced once on the wet pavement before rolling into the ditch, disappearing into the tall grass. I sat there for a minute, my heart racing. I could still hear that whisper in the back of my head, urging me to turn around, go back, take just one sip. But I didn't. I wasn't about to let whatever was in that water take me the way it had taken everyone else. I drove through the night, my mind stuck on what I'd seen. I didn't have any real answers. I didn't know what that thing in the lake was or why the town had been pulled into it. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to find out. By the time I reached the next town, the sun was starting to rise. The rain had stopped completely, leaving the streets wet and glistening in the early morning light. I pulled into a gas station, my hands still trembling as I turned off the engine. Inside, I grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler and made sure it wasn't from clear water before taking a long drink. It tasted normal. No metallic aftertaste, no strange fog settling over my mind, just plain, old bottled water. I leaned against the counter, trying to shake the memories of clear water, but it wasn't that easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the lake, saw the people walking into it, saw the blackness rise up from beneath the surface, pulling them down. The clerk behind the counter gave me a strange look. "You all right, man?" he asked, his voice casual, like he'd seen people like me before, people who'd been through something they couldn't explain. "Yeah," I muttered, forcing a smile, "just passing through." I paid for the water and left the gas station, trying to convince myself that I could leave Clearwater behind, that it was over. But as I got back into the car, something caught my eye. In the rearview mirror, there was a small trickle of water running down the side of my window. At first, I thought it was just rainwater from the storm, but then I noticed the color. It wasn't clear, it was black. And that's when I knew Clearwater wasn't finished with me yet. The town, the lake, whatever was in that water, it was still out there, and somehow it was still with me. I drove away, knowing that no matter how far I went, I couldn't outrun what I'd seen. I couldn't outrun the water, and I couldn't escape the darkness beneath it. So, let me tell you something that still freaks me out to this day. You know how kids have those imaginary friends, right? Well, I used to think that was just part of growing up. Kids making stuff up to keep themselves company. But what happened with my son, Ben? That was no typical imaginary friend thing. It was something else, something darker. We just moved to this small town after my wife, Sarah, passed away. Yeah, I know. Cliché move. Single dad trying to start over in a quiet place, hoping a change of scenery might help. Anyway, it was just me and Ben. He was 6 at the time, and I could tell he was struggling. Kids don't exactly have the words to say, "Hey dad, I'm messed up from losing mom," you know? So he started spending a lot of time alone in his room. At first, I thought he just needed space, and I didn't push him. I figured he'd come around. Then one evening, after dinner, he casually mentioned his new friend, Jerry. I didn't think much of it, honestly. Every kid has an imaginary friend at some point, right? So I played along. "What's Jerry like?" I asked, and Ben smiled, this big proud smile, and told me Jerry was funny and always nice to him. I thought, well, at least he's not sad anymore. But the thing is, Ben started talking about Jerry a lot. Like a lot. And it wasn't just kid stuff like Jerry likes pizza or whatever. No, it was more like, "Jerry told me not to go outside today, Daddy," or "Jerry doesn't like Mrs. Wilkins, she's mean," which was weird because Mrs. Wilkins was Ben's teacher, and from what I'd seen, she was a nice lady. I should have put 2 and 2 together back then, but you don't think your kid's imaginary friend is anything more than make-believe. I mean, why would you? You've got work, bills, and a million other things on your mind. But things started happening around the house. Little things at first, like I'd find toys moved when I know I put them away, or the TV would turn on in the middle of the night. I figured it was just old wiring, or maybe the move had me all disoriented. But then, pets started disappearing around the neighborhood. Cats mostly, but a couple of dogs too. And every time I'd ask Ben about school or what he was up to, he'd just say, "Jerry says they went away," with this creepy kind of smile. And I'd laugh it off, you know? Like, "Oh, that's silly, Ben. Cats don't just disappear." But something about the way he said it stuck with me. One night, it was raining hard, real stormy. We were sitting in the living room, me watching TV, Ben playing with his blocks. And out of nowhere, Ben says, "Jerry doesn't like you watching TV, Daddy." Now look, I'll be honest, that one got to me. But I laughed it off, because what else are you supposed to do, right? I said, "Well, tell Jerry it's my house, and I get to watch whatever I want." Ben didn't say anything after that, just went back to playing. But the power cut out a second later, and yeah, I'll admit I was a little freaked out. But it's an old house, and it was raining pretty hard, so I didn't think too much of it. I lit a candle, grabbed a flashlight, and we called it a night. But as I was putting Ben to bed, he whispered, "Jerry's mad at you, Daddy." That was the first time I felt like something was seriously wrong. Still, I convinced myself it was just the weird stuff kids say. You know how they are. I tucked him in, kissed him goodnight, and went back to my room. But I didn't sleep much that night. Kept hearing the rain pounding against the window. A few days after that whole power outage thing, I started noticing more strange stuff with Ben. The kid was acting like nothing had happened, which honestly made it even weirder. He was still talking to Jerry, like it was no big deal, but now his conversations were getting darker, I guess. It wasn't all about what toy to play with or what snack he wanted anymore. It was things like, Jerry doesn't like it when you're home all day, Daddy, or Jerry says you should leave the lights off more. Harmless on the surface, sure, but the vibe was off. You know what I mean? I probably should have done something right then, maybe called a therapist or something. But I was in denial, plain and simple. I kept thinking it was just him dealing with Sarah being gone, that it was all grief and imagination, wrapped up in one. Judge me if you want, but it's easy to rationalize weird stuff when you're trying to hold it together. Then Ben's teacher, Mrs. Wilkins, had her accident, so I'm at work, right? It's pouring again, surprise, surprise. I get a call from the school saying Mrs. Wilkins fell down a flight of stairs and would be out for a while. They didn't give details, just that she'd be in the hospital for at least a couple of weeks. I think I mumbled something polite and hung up. But the whole time, Ben's words were replaying in my head. Jerry doesn't like Mrs. Wilkins. I know it sounds nuts, but I swear on my life, it felt connected. When I picked Ben up that day, I casually asked him how school was, like I wasn't totally freaked out. He shrugged and said, Mrs. Wilkins fell. Jerry told me she would. I laughed it off again, because what else do you do? But in my head I'm thinking, what the hell is going on here? Over the next few weeks, I noticed a pattern. Anyone Ben or Jerry didn't like, something bad would happen. First it was Mrs. Wilkins, but then it was the neighbor, old man Kramer. He had one of those yappy dogs always barking. Ben mentioned a few times that Jerry hated that dog. Well, one morning, Kramer knocks on my door, clearly shaken, saying his dog's gone missing. Vanished out of the backyard overnight. He was pissed, talking about putting up flyers and asking if I'd seen anything. I told him I hadn't, and he stormed off. But when I turned back to Ben, he was just standing there, watching. And get this, he said, Jerry says the dog's not coming back. Now I'm seriously questioning my sanity. Part of me thinks I'm just reading too much into it. I mean, kids say weird stuff, right? But part of me, the part that didn't want to admit it, was starting to get really scared. A couple nights later, it rained again, heavy like before. Ben was already asleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to check on him. When I walked into his room, I found him sitting up in bed, talking. But not in that playful, imaginative way kids do when they're pretending. No, he was whispering, having what sounded like a full-blown conversation with Jerry. I couldn't make out everything, but I heard enough. Ben was asking Jerry when the next person was going to leave. I stood in the doorway for a second, my mouth dry, trying to process what the hell I was hearing. I wanted to step in, to stop whatever this was, but I just stood there like an idiot. Then Ben turned to me, calm as you please, and said, Jerry says you should go back to bed, Daddy. And for whatever reason, I did. After that night, things got, well, they got worse. I started avoiding Ben's room after dark. Not proud of it, but there it is. The rain seemed to come more often, too, like some cosmic joke, making everything feel damp and heavy all the time. I'd hear Ben whispering to Jerry every night, and I didn't know what to do about it. I felt like I was losing it. Then Eric, my best friend, came by one evening. He'd always been good with Ben, but even he noticed something was off. Ben didn't want to hang out with him anymore, which was weird because they used to be close. Eric pulled me aside that night and said, Man, I don't know how else to say this, but you've got to get a handle on Ben. He's acting strange, Tom. Like, really strange. I didn't want to hear it. I mean, part of me knew something was wrong, but when someone else says it, that makes it real. So I brushed Eric off. I told him it was just a phase, that Ben was still dealing with his mom's death. Eric wasn't buying it, though. I get that, he said, but this is different. He was glaring at me like he hated me, You've got to talk to him. Jerry doesn't like Eric, Ben said later that night, out of nowhere. We were sitting in the kitchen, eating mac and cheese, and he just dropped it like it was nothing. I almost choked on my dinner. I tried to play it cool, saying something like, well, Jerry doesn't get to decide who our friends are. Ben just looked at me, dead serious, and said, Jerry says Eric shouldn't come around anymore. Jerry says bad things happen to people who make you mad. Yeah, that one stuck with me. A part of me wanted to shake Ben and demand to know what the hell was going on, but another part of me, an embarrassingly large part, didn't want to dig too deep. I figured if I didn't ask, I wouldn't have to deal with whatever answer I'd get. But it was too late for that. The next day, I get a call from the hospital. Eric was in a car accident. He was banged up pretty bad, but he'd survive. When I asked Ben if he knew what happened to Eric, he just smiled and said, Jerry told me. He doesn't like when you don't listen. That was it for me. I couldn't pretend this was just kid stuff anymore. Something was seriously wrong, and I had to confront it. That night, the rain was coming down hard again, because of course it was, and I went into Ben's room. He was sitting on the floor, building something with his blocks, but I could feel it. The tension, the weirdness. I don't know how else to explain it, but it was like the air was wrong. Ben, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, we need to talk about Jerry. He didn't look up, just kept stacking his blocks like he didn't have a care in the world. Jerry doesn't want to talk to you, he said, and I swear to you, it wasn't Ben's voice that came out of him. It was lower, scratchy, like something out of a bad horror movie. I froze. I didn't know what to say or do. My kid was sitting there, speaking like someone or something else entirely. Finally, I managed to get out. Ben, who is Jerry? And then he looked up at me, his eyes cold and unblinking. Jerry says you should leave us alone, he said. Jerry says you're the one who doesn't belong here. I tried to stay calm, but I was terrified. This wasn't my kid anymore. Not really. I'm your dad, Ben. I'm not going anywhere. Ben's face twisted into something almost mocking. Jerry says you can't stop him. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up in the living room, listening to the rain, wondering how the hell I was going to handle this. I mean, how do you deal with something like that? How do you protect your kid from something you can't even understand? I knew I had to find out what was going on, or lose Ben forever. After that night, I couldn't let it go. Whatever was happening with Ben and Jerry, yeah, I know how ridiculous that sounds. I needed answers. I was past the point of pretending this was just grief or imagination. This was something else, something worse. So I went back to the library. I'd been there once before when we first moved to town, but I'd never really dug into the local history. Now, I was desperate for anything that might explain what the hell was going on with my kid. The librarian, an older lady named Mrs. Turner, must have seen how frazzled I was because she asked me if I needed help. I didn't even bother pretending. My son, I said, he's got this imaginary friend, but I think there's something wrong. Does that make any sense? Mrs. Turner gave me a long look, then slowly nodded. You're not the first parent to come in here with a story like that, she said, which was definitely not the answer I was expecting. She led me to a section in the back where all the local archives were kept and pulled out a dusty old file. There's a history in this town, especially with the children. She laid the file in front of me, and that's when I found it. A story from the 1950s about a boy named Thomas Grayson, the same last name as mine, but no relation. He was 7 years old, and according to the reports, he had an imaginary friend named Jerry. Sound familiar? Thomas had started acting strange, just like Ben. The kid talked to Jerry all the time, telling his parents that Jerry didn't like certain people, that Jerry wanted them to do things. The parents didn't think much of it at first, same mistake I made, but then things escalated. People around town started getting hurt, and Thomas would always say, Jerry did it. And then, one night, Thomas's whole family was found dead. The police said it looked like an accident, a gas leak, but the neighbors swore they heard the boy talking to someone, even though he was the only one home. The kicker? Thomas disappeared, gone without a trace. I sat there, staring at those old yellowed pages, feeling like the floor had dropped out from under me. I wanted to believe this was all some bizarre coincidence. But that was getting harder and harder to convince myself. I asked Mrs. Turner if she knew anything else, and she gave me a grim look. "It's happened a few times since then," she said quietly. "Every few decades, a child starts talking about Jerry. Things start going wrong. People get hurt, or worse." Worse. Great. Just what I wanted to hear. I tried asking her if there was a way to stop it, but she didn't have much advice beyond, "Don't let it go too far." As if I hadn't already let it go way too far. That night, I went home, rain beating against the windows like it had every other damn time something strange had happened. Ben was already asleep when I got there, but I sat outside his room for a long time, just listening. Listening for that voice. For Jerry. I didn't hear anything, but that didn't make me feel any better. I couldn't get that story out of my head. The boy who vanished. The dead family. What if that's where this was headed? What if Ben was next? I wasn't going to wait around to find out. The next morning, I started researching anything I could find on demonic possession, curses, paranormal stuff. Things I never believed in before, but, desperate times. I found a few obscure forums where people shared stories about demons that preyed on kids, taking the form of imaginary friends. It all sounded too insane to be real. But then again, so was what was happening in my house. One post stood out. It talked about confronting the demon head-on, reminding the child who they are, what they love, using their memories and emotions to break the demon's hold. It sounded like something out of a cheesy movie, but at this point, I was willing to try anything. I knew I had to act fast, because Ben was slipping away from me, and Jerry was getting stronger. I'll never forget the night it all came to a head. It was raining again, because of course it was, and I knew, deep down, this was my last chance to save Ben. I'd been reading all day, trying to figure out how to face down this thing that had taken hold of my kid, but none of the research could fully prepare me for what was coming. I just had to go in and hope I didn't screw it up. That evening, I found Ben in his room, sitting on the floor like always, talking to Jerry. The sound of his whispering, it was unsettling, like he was having a conversation with someone who wasn't just make-believe. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I knew I couldn't let fear take over. This was my son. I wasn't going to lose him to some demonic thing. I stepped into the room and sat down across from him. "Ben," I said quietly, "we need to talk." He didn't look up from his toys. "Jerry doesn't want to talk to you," he said, that same low voice I'd heard before. It wasn't Ben's voice, at least not entirely. I felt the hair on the back of my neck prickle, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I'm not talking to Jerry," I said. "I'm talking to you, Ben. You remember when we used to build forts together? Remember how we'd spend hours in the backyard, making those ridiculous tents out of sheets, pretending they were castles? You loved that." He didn't say anything. Just kept stacking his blocks like I wasn't even there. But I could tell something in him shifted. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I kept going. "What about when we'd read stories before bed? You'd always want Goodnight Moon, even though you'd heard it 1,000 times. Remember that? You'd laugh every time I said the cow jumped over the moon, like it was the funniest thing in the world." For a second, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but then his face twisted into something dark. Something angry. "Jerry says you should stop," he said, his voice sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. But I wasn't stopping. Not this time. "Ben, listen to me. Jerry's not your friend. He's hurting you. He's making you do things you don't want to do. Think about your mom. She wouldn't want this for you. She loved you more than anything, Ben. She'd want you to be happy, not this." That hit a nerve. Ben's hands started to shake, and the blocks tumbled to the floor. He looked up at me, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, I saw my son. The real Ben. His eyes were wide, scared. "Daddy, I'm scared," he whispered. "Ben, it's okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, even though I was feeling anything but okay. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. But you need to let go of Jerry. He's not real, Ben. He's not your friend." And that's when it happened. The room. I don't even know how to describe it. The air felt heavy, thick, like something was pressing down on us. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, almost like they were alive, twisting and writhing. And then I heard it, a voice, low and guttural, coming from the darkest corner of the room. "You can't take him from me," the voice rasped. It wasn't Ben. It wasn't anything human. It was Jerry. Or whatever the hell Jerry really was. I stood up, putting myself between Ben and the corner. "You're not welcome here," I said, not even sure what I was doing. I felt ridiculous, talking to a damn shadow, but I couldn't let it take my son. "You don't belong here. You don't own him." The voice laughed, this horrible, wet sound that made my skin crawl. "He's mine. You can't save him." But I didn't stop. I reached out to Ben, pulling him close, holding him tight. "You're stronger than him, Ben. You're my son. You're our son. Mine and your mom's. We love you, Ben. We'll always love you. Jerry doesn't love you. He's lying to you." Ben started sobbing, burying his face in my chest, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then the shadows shifted, lunging toward us, the voice screaming something I couldn't even understand. It was like the whole room was collapsing in on itself. But I didn't let go of Ben. I held him tighter, whispering to him, reminding him of who he was, of his family, of the love he still had in his life. And slowly, the shadows began to retreat. The air lightened. The voice faded, growing weaker and weaker until it was gone. I don't know how long we sat there, but eventually Ben's crying stopped. He looked up at me, his face red and tear-streaked, but it was him, my son. "Daddy, is Jerry gone?" I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. But yeah, Jerry was gone, for now at least. After that, we left town, packed up, and never looked back. I don't know if Jerry's really gone for good, but I'm not taking any chances. Ben hasn't mentioned him since, and I hope to God he never will. But sometimes on rainy nights, I think I still feel something watching us. Okay, so this whole thing started right after Claire died. I mean, it's not like I was doing great before, but after she was gone, I just completely fell apart. There's something about grief, it just eats you alive. And no matter what you do, you feel like you're drowning in it. People were telling me to get help, like I hadn't already thought of that. Claire and I had been fighting that night. Nothing serious, just one of those stupid arguments about nothing. But she stormed out. And well, you know the rest. So when someone at work mentioned this therapy group, The Circle, I figured I'd give it a shot. It was either that or keep drinking myself into a coma every night. So yeah, I signed up. The sessions were in the basement of some old church downtown, and I swear, just walking into that place made me feel like I was stepping into another century. Everything about it was, well, let's just say it wasn't winning any awards for modern decor. It was raining that first night, of course. The kind of rain that makes you question why you ever bothered leaving your house in the first place. I was already regretting it when I pulled into the parking lot, the rain bouncing off my windshield, and I just sat there, wondering if it was even worth it. But I got out of the car, half expecting to turn right back around, and made my way through the downpour, water sloshing around my shoes. Inside, I shook off as much as I could and went downstairs. The basement was dim, kind of musty, and smelled like a mix of old wood and mildew, which didn't do anything for my nerves. There was a circle of chairs set up, and I was the last one to arrive, of course. They all looked at me like I was some kind of zoo exhibit. It wasn't that they were unfriendly, more like they were curious, I could almost hear the question in their heads. What's this guy's damage? I took the empty seat and nodded at everyone, just trying to be invisible. The therapist, Dr. Keller, was already there, sitting in this oversized armchair like he was holding court or something. Middle-aged guy, kind of bland looking, but with this weird intensity in his eyes. Not the comforting, warm therapist type you see on TV. He had more of an I see right through you vibe, which, let me tell you, didn't help with the whole nervous new guy thing. "Welcome, Jack," he said, giving me this smile that felt, I don't know, too wide for his face. "We're glad you could join us." Everyone else murmured their own hellos, and I just nodded again, trying not to stand out. The other members, well, they all had their own stories. Sarah was this woman in her late 30s, and she just had this look of someone who had seen too much. You could tell. Then there was Ethan, kind of scruffy with that recovering alcoholic vibe going on. Paula looked like someone who might snap if you said the wrong thing, all jittery and tense, And Richard, well, Richard barely talked, so there wasn't much to go on with him. Just this quiet, watchful guy who sat in the corner and stared a lot. So we went around the circle, doing that introduce yourself thing, which, yeah, felt as awkward as it sounds. People shared their issues, their grief, and the air in that room. Man, it got heavier with every story. And when it was my turn, I didn't even know where to start. I talked about Claire, how she was gone, how it was my fault, how the guilt was eating me alive. Dr. Keller didn't say much while I spoke, just nodded and made these little humming noises. Supportive, I guess. But his eyes were locked on me the whole time, like he was peeling back layers of my skin or something, seeing things I wasn't even saying. After the session, I felt lighter, maybe, like I'd gotten something off my chest. But at the same time, there was this nagging feeling, like I'd said too much, or maybe just cracked something open inside me that I wasn't ready to deal with. I walked back out into the rain, the water pouring down even harder than before, and for a second, I stood there, letting it wash over me. But as I drove home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The circle wasn't what I thought it would be, and I couldn't put my finger on why. So after that first session, I figured, hey, it wasn't so bad, right? I mean, yeah, I left feeling weird, but that's therapy, isn't it? You dig up all the crap you've buried deep down, and it's bound to feel uncomfortable. But I kept going back, week after week, because what else was I going to do? Sit at home, staring at Claire's empty side of the bed? Yeah, no thanks. It's funny, though. Each time I went, it got harder to leave the room. Like emotionally, you know? Something about being in that basement just sucked me in. I started opening up more, sharing more details about Claire and our fights, about the guilt I carried around like a backpack full of rocks. It's not like I wanted to talk about it, but every time I sat in that circle, it's like the words just spilled out of me. And I wasn't the only one. The others were doing it too. Sarah started talking more about her kid. Ethan shared these intense stories from when he was deep in his alcoholism. And Paula, well, let's just say Paula had some dark stuff going on from her past. She'd talk about her childhood, and man, you could see the rage in her eyes. But what really got to me was how Keller just sat there, soaking it all up, like he fed off it or something. I know, it sounds crazy, but there was this look on his face every time someone opened up, like he enjoyed it too much, if that makes sense. Then Ethan disappeared. Just like that. Gone. 1 week, he was there, talking about how he almost lost his family because of his drinking. And the next week, Keller tells us he relapsed and checked himself into rehab. Now, I've been around enough guys with addiction problems to know that people drop off the radar, but something about it didn't sit right with me. It was the way Keller said it, like he wasn't surprised at all. After Ethan's relapse, things started getting weird, even weirder than they already were. Paula, who had always been edgy, suddenly got, I don't know, violent? She would come into sessions all wound up, practically shaking, and once, she almost threw a chair, over nothing. Keller didn't seem concerned, though. In fact, he leaned into it. He asked her more questions, pushing her to talk about her anger, her trauma. And Paula, she didn't hold back. She started talking about how she wanted to hurt people, how she fantasized about it, and Keller just encouraged her. He'd nod, smile, tell her it was good, she was being honest. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there like, what the hell is happening here? I didn't say anything, though. Part of me thought maybe this was just what therapy was, messy and uncomfortable. But the other part of me, I knew something was off. Sarah, though. Sarah was different. She was quieter than usual, not as open as the rest of us. But one night after the session, she pulled me aside. It was still raining, seemed like it was always raining after these meetings, and we stood outside under the overhang, just watching the water pour down. She told me she didn't trust Keller. She said there was something about him, something dark. I remember laughing it off like, yeah, the guy's a little intense, but he's a therapist. He's supposed to dig deep, right? But Sarah just shook her head, staring at the rain like it had all the answers. No, she said, it's more than that. He's doing something to us. Can't you feel it? I didn't know what to say to that. I mean, she wasn't wrong. I did feel like something was changing, but it was hard to explain. I figured it was just the therapy messing with my head, stirring up old feelings I hadn't dealt with. But Sarah looked dead serious, and it rattled me. She told me she felt like the group wasn't helping anymore, that it was doing the opposite. I thought maybe she was just having a bad night, but deep down, I started to wonder if she was right. The next session, things went completely off the rails. Paula showed up, and she looked off. Like she hadn't slept in days, bags under her eyes, hair all tangled up, and she didn't sit down. She paced the room like a caged animal, muttering to herself. Keller, though, he didn't look surprised at all. He just watched her, eyes gleaming like he was waiting for her to crack. And crack she did. Paula stopped in the middle of the room, turned to all of us, and screamed. Screamed about how she couldn't take it anymore, how everything inside her was boiling over. And before any of us could react, she threw a chair across the room. Keller just sat there, calm as ever, like this was all part of the plan. I left that night in a daze, rain pouring down again, soaking me as I walked to my car. But this time something felt different, something darker, and I wasn't sure I wanted to come back, but I knew I would, because now I was in too deep. After that night with Paula, I should have stopped going. I mean, anyone with half a brain would have said, "Hey, this group is making things worse, not better." But for some reason, I couldn't stop myself. I kept showing up, every week, rain or shine though. Let's be honest, it was mostly rain. I told myself I needed the therapy, that I wasn't ready to deal with Claire's death on my own, but deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. There was something else pulling me back to that basement, like I didn't have a choice anymore, like I needed to be there. Sarah wasn't coming as much, though. I noticed it right away. One week, she'd show up, sit through the session in silence, and then the next, she'd be a no-show. I couldn't blame her. She'd made it clear she didn't trust Keller, and honestly, I was starting to see what she meant. The guy was getting creepier. Every time one of us shared something personal, especially the really dark stuff, he'd just sit there, leaning in with that weird smile, like he was feeding off it. It was subtle at first, but once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. Then things started getting really messed up. One night, Richard, the quiet guy, the one who never said much, finally opened up. We were all just sitting there, doing the usual round of sharing, and out of nowhere, Richard starts talking. And not just talking, but confessing. He told us about this time in his past, something he'd never mentioned before, about how he'd hurt someone. Bad. His voice was low, almost a whisper, and you could feel the tension in the room grow as he spoke. He didn't give details, but you could tell it was serious, something that had been eating away at him for years. And the whole time, Keller just sat there, nodding, smiling that same damn smile, encouraging him to keep going, to dig deeper. And Richard did. He talked about his anger, how it controlled him, how he felt like it was something inside him that he couldn't escape. By the time he was done, the rest of us were just sitting there, stunned. No one said a word. But Keller? He clapped his hands together and said, "That's progress, Richard. You've taken the first step. Like this was just another day in therapy." After the session, I cornered Keller. I had to ask him what the hell was going on. I mean, Richard? The guy had been practically a ghost for weeks, and now, suddenly, he's talking about hurting people. Something about it felt wrong, like Keller was pushing him too far. But when I confronted him, Keller didn't even flinch. He just gave me this calm, almost condescending look, and said, "Healing isn't always comfortable, Jack. You should know that by now." And maybe that was true, maybe therapy is uncomfortable. But this wasn't healing. This felt like something else entirely. Then, just like with Ethan, Richard disappeared. One week he's there, spilling his guts, and the next week, gone. Keller told us Richard had decided to take some time for himself, whatever that meant. But by now, I was starting to see a pattern. First Ethan, now Richard. And Paula? She wasn't exactly gone, but after that night when she threw the chair, she stopped coming altogether. Word around town was she'd had a run-in with the cops, something about attacking a guy at a gas station, but no one knew the details. It was just me and Sarah now. And I could tell she was barely holding on. We sat through those sessions, just the two of us, while Keller kept doing his thing, asking questions, pushing us to open up. But it wasn't the same anymore. The circle felt empty, wrong. And the more I talked, the more I felt like I was losing control. Like the things I was saying weren't even mine. Like I was being fed these thoughts, these memories, and I was just repeating them without even thinking. One night, after a particularly brutal session where I talked about Claire in a way I never had before, I went outside and found Sarah waiting for me. It was pouring again, naturally, and she was standing there, hood up, looking like she hadn't slept in days. She grabbed my arm and pulled me under the overhang. "You need to listen to me, Jack," she said, her voice low, urgent. "There's something wrong with Keller. He's not what he seems." I wanted to laugh it off, tell her she was being paranoid, but I couldn't, because the truth was I was starting to feel it too. There was something about him, something about this whole damn group that wasn't right. And the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Ethan's disappearance, Richard's confession, Paula's outburst, it all lined up. Sarah told me she'd done some digging. Turns out, Keller wasn't even his real name. There had been another group, years ago, in a different town, led by someone who looked just like Keller, but with a different name. And that group? It ended in a bloodbath. The members had all killed each other. I stood there in the rain, my mind racing, trying to process what she was saying. It sounded insane, like something out of a bad horror movie, but the more I thought about it, the more it clicked. Keller wasn't just a therapist. He was something else, something darker. And whatever it was feeding on us. I should have run right then, packed up, left town, got as far away from Keller and that damn group as possible. But I didn't. Part of me didn't believe it, or maybe I didn't want to believe it. What Sarah was saying, it was just too crazy, too out there. But then again, everything felt out there lately. The things we'd been talking about in those sessions, the way Keller pushed us. I couldn't deny it anymore. Something was seriously wrong. But I didn't leave. Instead, I kept going back, because I couldn't shake this pull, this feeling that I had to be there. It's hard to explain. It wasn't like I wanted to go, but it felt like I needed to, like I wasn't in control anymore. And then there was Sarah. She was scared, and I couldn't just leave her hanging. We agreed to stick together, keep an eye on Keller, try to figure out what the hell was going on. I know it sounds stupid now, but at the time it felt like the right thing to do, like we had to see it through. The next session was different. Keller seemed off, more intense than usual, in the basement. It felt colder, darker somehow. There were still only the two of us, me and Sarah, but Keller didn't seem bothered by the empty seats. In fact, he seemed pleased. Like this was all going exactly the way he wanted. We went through the motions at first, talking about our grief, our anger, the usual stuff. But then Keller did something he hadn't done before. He started asking us about our worst memories, the ones we hadn't shared yet. He wanted us to go deeper, to dredge up the really painful stuff. I don't know why, but I couldn't stop myself. It was like he had his hooks in me, pulling everything out. I started talking about things I'd never told anyone. About Claire, about the fights, about that night she died. I don't even know how long I talked. It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. When I finally stopped, I looked over at Sarah, and she was just staring at me. Not like she was surprised or shocked by what I'd said, but more like she didn't even recognize me anymore. Then Keller turned to her, and his smile grew. "And you, Sarah," he said, his voice low, almost soothing. "What about your son? What's the one thing you've never told anyone about him?" Sarah froze. She looked down at the floor, like she was trying to avoid his gaze. But Keller didn't stop. He kept pressing her, his voice getting softer, more insistent. I could see it in her face, the way she was struggling to hold it in, but eventually, she cracked. I let him die," she whispered. "I was supposed to be watching him, but I wasn't. I was drinking." Her voice broke, and she started sobbing, her whole body shaking. "He drowned. He was just a baby, and I wasn't there. It's my fault." The room went dead silent after that, and Keller just sat back, smiling like he'd won something. I wanted to say something to comfort her, but I couldn't move. It was like the air was thick, heavy, pressing down on me. And then Keller stood up. He walked over to Sarah and put his hand on her shoulder, and I swear, the room got even colder. "It's good that you've shared that, Sarah," he said, his voice so calm, so wrong. "It's important to let go of your guilt, but you can't run from it anymore." Sarah looked up at him, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. What do you mean?" she whispered. Keller smiled again, but this time there was something different in his eyes. Something dark. "You know exactly what I mean," he said softly. "It's time to accept the truth. You wanted him to die. Deep down, you knew your life would be easier without him, didn't you?" Sarah gasped, shaking her head, but Keller kept going, his voice growing more insistent, more commanding. "It's okay, Sarah. You don't have to lie to yourself anymore. Just admit it. You hated him for ruining your life, for holding you back. You wanted him gone." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I wanted to yell, to tell Keller to shut the hell up, but I couldn't move. It was like I was paralyzed, forced to watch as Keller twisted the knife deeper into Sarah's soul. And then, in the middle of all of it, Sarah snapped. She jumped up from her chair and lunged at Keller, screaming, "You're lying. I never wanted that. I loved him." She swung at him, her fists flying out, but Keller just stood there, completely unfazed, like he knew this was coming. I tried to get up, to pull her away, but before I could, Keller grabbed her by the wrists, his grip impossibly strong. "It's time to face the truth, Sarah," he whispered, his voice cold as ice. "You know what you have to do." And then it happened. I don't know how to describe it, but it was like something passed between them. One moment, Sarah was fighting him, and the next, she just stopped. She went completely still, her eyes locked on Keller's, and for a second, it was like she wasn't even there anymore. Keller let go of her wrists and stepped back, smiling that same damn smile. "Good," he said quietly. "Now you understand." Sarah turned slowly, her face completely blank, and walked toward the door. I called out to her, tried to stop her, but she didn't even look at me. She just kept walking, like she was in a trance. I chased after her, but by the time I got outside, she was already gone. The rain was coming down hard, and I stood there, drenched, my heart racing, wondering what the hell had just happened. And then, in the distance, I heard a scream. It was Sarah. I swear I ran faster than I ever have in my life, chasing after Sarah. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the streets were practically rivers by the time I caught up with her. She was standing there in the middle of the road, soaked through, staring up at the sky like she didn't even feel the rain. And she was screaming. God, it was the kind of scream that hits you right in the gut, like something inside her had just shattered. I grabbed her by the shoulders, trying to shake her out of whatever trance she was in. "Sarah," I shouted, over the sound of the rain pounding the pavement. "Sarah, snap out of it. Come on, we gotta get out of here." But she wouldn't even look at me. She just kept screaming, her face twisted in pain, like something was being ripped out of her. I didn't know what else to do, so I hugged her, held on as tight as I could, and prayed she'd snap out of it. Eventually, she stopped screaming. Her whole body went limp, and she just collapsed into my arms. We stood there in the middle of that empty street, rain pouring down around us, and I knew something had broken inside her. Maybe it was the guilt, or maybe it was Keller, or maybe it was just everything. But whatever it was, she wasn't the same anymore. I don't know how long we stood there, but eventually, I got her to move. I took her back to my car, and we sat there in silence, the rain drumming on the roof like a reminder that the world was still moving, even if everything else had come to a halt. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? That night was the last time I saw Sarah. I dropped her off at her apartment, and she gave me this look. Like she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Then she turned and walked inside, and I knew she wasn't coming back. Not to the circle, not to me, not to anyone. She was gone, just like the others. I didn't sleep that night. Hell, I don't think I slept for days. I kept thinking about Keller, about what he'd said to Sarah, about how he'd twisted her pain into something else, something dark. And I kept wondering if I was next. If he was going to do the same thing to me, I could feel it, this pull, like a weight on my chest, dragging me back to that basement, back to him. I didn't want to go to the next session. Every part of me was screaming to stay away, but it was like I didn't have a choice. I had to see this through. I had to know what was really going on. When I got to the church that night, the rain had finally stopped. The air was heavy like the calm after a storm, and the whole place felt different. The lights were dimmer, the shadows longer, and I swear I could hear this low hum like the building itself was alive. I walked down to the basement, and Keller was already there, sitting in his usual spot, that same smug smile on his face. But this time, it was just me. No Sarah, no Ethan, no Paula, no Richard. Just me and Keller. "Where are the others?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "They're no longer part of the process," he said, his voice smooth, almost gentle. "It's just you now, Jack. You're the last one." I sat down, feeling the weight of his words settle over me like a blanket. "What the hell are you doing to us?" I asked. My voice was shaking, but I didn't care. "Why are you messing with our heads? What do you want?" Keller leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his eyes locked on mine. "It's not about what I want, Jack," he said, that smile never leaving his face. "It's about what you need. You came here to face your pain, your guilt. You came here to be free." "Free?" I spat the word out like it was poison. "You think you're setting us free? You've been pushing us, feeding off us, making everything worse." Keller chuckled softly, like I just told a joke. "No, Jack. I've been helping you let go. Your grief, your guilt, it's been weighing you down for so long, hasn't it? Claire's death, the fights, the way you've been blaming yourself. It's time to stop running from it. It's time to accept it." And that's when it hit me. He wasn't just some messed up therapist. He wasn't even human. I don't know what he was, but I knew then that he'd been feeding on us, on our pain, our trauma, everything that made us feel broken. He'd twisted it, made it worse, because that's how he got stronger. That's what he wanted. I stood up, ready to leave, ready to get as far away from him as possible, but Keller's voice stopped me in my tracks. "You can't leave, Jack," he said quietly. "You've already given me so much. You're almost free." I turned to face him, and for the first time, I saw it. The real Keller. His eyes were darker, his skin seemed to pulse with something beneath the surface, and that smile, it wasn't human. "What the hell are you?" I whispered, more to myself than to him. "I'm here to help," he said, standing up slowly, his presence filling the room. "But you need to do the rest. You need to let go of Claire. You need to accept what you did." And just like that, I knew what he was trying to do. He wanted me to confess, to say that I'd wanted her to die, that I'd let her leave that night because part of me didn't care if she came back. He wanted me to say it, to believe it, because that's how he'd win. But I didn't. I wouldn't. I turned and ran, faster than I ever had, not stopping until I burst through the doors at church and out into the night. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew that Keller, whatever he was, would be waiting for someone else, someone like me, broken and vulnerable, looking for help in all the wrong places. And maybe they'd go into that basement, sit in that circle, and feel like they were getting better. But I know the truth now. There's no getting better. Not when you're in his circle. Thank you for joining me tonight on In the Shadows. As the story ends, the rain will continue for 30 more minutes. A black screen awaits, so you can relax and drift off peacefully. Or, if you're still awake, explore more scary stories on the channel. Whatever you choose, I'm grateful you're here. Until next time, sleep well and stay in the shadows.